All right, welcome everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments here. I just want to give everybody a chance to get their audio settled in. All right, seems a good critical mass to start. So I'll make sure that I type this out in the chat for people that come in after I deliver this, but welcome to today's webinar. To be clear, this is Zoom webinar, so that means a few things that are different from Zoom meeting. The most important one is that your cameras and your microphones are disabled by default. So you don't have to worry about interrupting us during the presentation or being seen, but that does mean if you have a question or if you want to have any kind of discussion, you'll have to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature. So if you use the chat feature, just make sure that you select everyone from the drop-down menu there if you want everyone to see your message. Otherwise, only we as the panelists can see it. And if you have a question for Geraldine or for someone from the Women's Caucus, then you can use the Q&A function there. You can ask those questions anonymously, and you can also view existing questions and upvote them if you so choose. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to today's host, Sarah Kessler. Sarah?
Welcome to today's Zoom Fatigue webinar. It's hosted by AACRAO's Women's Caucus. We were founded about 3 years ago, and the Women's Caucus supports professional development, networking, community building, and the discussion of issues specific to all women, including cisgender and transgender women, femmes, and non-binary people throughout college and university communities. Today, our speaker is Dr. Geraldine Fauville, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Education, Communication, and Learning at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Her presentation today focuses on the use of video conferencing that went from novelty to a necessity in 2020, as most of us know. There was a scarcity of academic research on the psychological effects and mechanisms of video conferencing or Zooming, and scholars needed tools to understand this drastically scaled usage. Her research revealed 5 dimensions of fatigue: general, social, emotional, visual, and motivational. Frequency and duration of Zoom meetings were associated with a higher level of fatigue, and fatigue was associated with negative attitudes towards Zoom meetings as well. Today, she will discuss the effects of Zoom fatigue, specifically on women, and ways that women can adjust to limit the effects of prolonged Zoom fatigue. Following the 30-minute webinar, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. As Mike stated earlier, please post questions in the Q&A function. In the chat, I'm going to post a link to AACRAO Women's Caucus for you to learn more, and also the presenter's research. And now, I'd like to welcome our presenter and featured speaker to discuss Zoom fatigue with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm gonna prepare to share my slide. Okay, so can you see my slide? Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to talk about our research on Zoom fatigue here today. So as we all know too well by now, in March last year, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, and a lot of public health measures were adopted by governments all around the world to slow down the spread of the virus. So video conference became this crucial tool for many of us to maintain some kind of normality in our lives. This led to this sudden increase in video conference usage, and you can see that in the graph on the left. The platform called Zoom that we're using today benefited from this increase. So the number of Zoom customers skyrocketed at the beginning of the pandemic. And Zoom became so widely used that people are now using the word Zoom to replace the term video conference, the same way we do with searching online and Googling. So this is why in this presentation and throughout our research, we use the word Zoom as a general term to refer to any video conference platforms. As people started spending more and more time on video conference, there was this general awakening concerning the exhaustion that people started to feel due to the very long hours they spend on Zoom. So in March 2020, my studies, along with the studies of all my colleagues from the Department of Communication at Stanford University, were all abruptly canceled. And all the members of our team ended up, of course, meeting on Zoom, and we had two favorite topics of discussion. The first one was how to keep being productive and doing research while our studies were shut down. And the second was how exhausted we felt spending all our time on Zoom. At the same time, we started hearing the term of Zoom fatigue in the media. So we decided to kill two birds with one stone, and we redirected our research focus towards Zoom fatigue, which was a phenomenon that we were experiencing and that had not been studied before. So today, I will summarize for you the finding of this past year of our research on Zoom fatigue. Okay, so during the presentation, first, we will look into some of the underlying causes of Zoom fatigue. Then we'll talk about the fact that we're not all equal in the eyes of Zoom fatigue. I will share some tips about how to mitigate Zoom fatigue. And finally, we talk about some of the limitation, the dissemination, and the future research concerning this research. So this will take about half an hour, and then we're going to have time for questions. Okay, so let's start by reviewing the mechanisms that seems to play a role in Zoom fatigue. These four mechanisms that I'm going to present were first identified by Professor Bellenson as the theoretical argument for the causes of Zoom fatigue. So basically, he looked into previous research in the field of communication and media, and from there, he suggested four mechanisms or causes that might be responsible for Zoom fatigue. And these four mechanisms were later on tested in our research. So the first cause of Zoom fatigue refers to the excessive amount of close-up eye contact. Okay, so nonverbal behavior in an elevator is a good way to look at this first mechanism. So when you're in an elevator, people are forced to stand very close to each other, like closer than would be acceptable with strangers. So people are forced to invade each other's personal bubble, which creates discomfort. So to compensate for this uncomfortable proximity, people tend to look away in order to minimize eye contact. So interpersonal proximity and eye contact are the two components of what we call the equilibrium theory. And these two behaviors are part of a trade-off that regulates intimacy between people. So in the case of the elevator, one aspect is too intense, so we mitigate the intimacy by decreasing the second one, so avoiding eye contact. And this trade-off has been reproduced also in different kind of research, such as with virtual human. In this experiment by Bellenson, the participants were wearing a virtual reality headset in which they could see a virtual agent. And the participants were asked to move around the physical room where they were. And the graph here shows the path that the participant took in relation to the virtual agent. The virtual agent is the red star. So in the graph to the right, the virtual agent was actually staring at the participant, who then maintained more interpersonal space from the agent. So now on Zoom, depending on the settings and the size of your screen and how many people participate in the call, other participants' face appear to be very large. And this large size is the equivalent of that person who would be standing uncomfortably close to you, like if they were invading your personal space. And in the elevator, to compensate for this physical proximity, people would reduce the amount of gaze to a minimum. But on Zoom, actually the opposite happens. not only are the faces very large, but since everyone is looking toward the camera, it feels like everyone is staring at you at all time. So this kind of proximity between two people is perceived by the brain as a situation that would lead to mating or to conflict. So it's a very intense situation for the brain. There is also another aspect of these staring faces. During in-person meeting, people will stare at you when you're speaking. But when someone else takes over, then the eyes are not on you anymore. You like off the hook. You're not the center of the attention anymore. And we know from previous research that there is this social anxiety of public speaking. It's very common. So during video conference, regardless if you're speaking or not, you have this feeling that everyone is staring at you at all time, which can be very intense. The second cause of Zoom fatigue refers to mirror anxiety. So when you are in a video conference with your camera on, you see the image from your own camera. So it's like spending your day with a mirror in front of you at all time. And research has shown that people are more likely to evaluate themselves when seeing a mirror image. So it's what psychologists call self-focused attention. So the mirror makes you more susceptible to compare yourself with others or with some kind of idea you have about who you should be or how you should look like. And this can lead to negative effects such as bad mood, depression, and anxiety. And this tendency for self-awareness in front of a mirror seems to be greater among women. So something that's also interesting is that these previous research on mirror and its impact on self-focused attention, in these studies, people were placed in front of their own image for like a few minutes, like maybe 5 minutes. In the case of the video conference for the moment, we are in front of our own image for hours on end. The third cause of Zoom fatigue is the reduced mobility. Again, we know from previous research that movement, both in terms of hand gesture, but also like walking around, all that is very important for collaboration, for creativity, and for learning. And during in-person meeting or phone call, people have the option to move around. But during video conference, when the camera is on, there is this expectation that you would stay facing the camera and in the view of the camera. So in some way you like trapped in the view of the camera. Okay, so the last mechanism of Zoom fatigue is what we call nonverbal communication. So nonverbal behavior, such as your body posture, the use of personal space, gaze and intonation, are very important when we communicate with each other. And this nonverbal communication is in many ways unconscious, spontaneous, but also extremely complex. During video conference, you only see the head and the shoulder of the other participant, so a lot of the nonverbal communication is lost. And so in order to understand what the other participants mean behind their word, you will need to consciously monitor the nonverbal behavior in a much more active way that you would do if you were in a face-to-face situation. Then on the other hand, in order for you to communicate this kind of cues to the other participant, you will have to intensify these cues. So for example, if you agree with something, you will nod much more vigorously and much longer than you would do if you were in the same room. Okay. So then in order to study Zoom fatigue, a first step for us was to create a tool to measure this Zoom fatigue, and it's what we call the ZEF scale for Zoom Exhaustion and Fatigue Scale. So the idea was to develop a questionnaire where people would self-report the fatigue they experience, which is something that's widely used in the field of research in fatigue. The questionnaire we developed was based on existing questionnaires, but also on interviews that we run with a lot of video conference users. The process took several months. We had to go through 5 different studies, so 5 different iterations of the scale, and we had more than 3,000 participants to finally reach this version. So we ended up with a questionnaire with 15 questions that cover 5 aspects of fatigue. As you can see, general fatigue, visual fatigue, social, motivational, and emotional fatigue. So for each question, the participant answers from on a 5-point scale from 1 corresponding to not at all experiencing what's in the question to 5 corresponding to extremely experiencing it. Based on the score from these 15 questions, a mean score is calculated. It's what we call the ZEF score. And it's the level of Zoom fatigue going from 1, no fatigue, to 5, extreme fatigue. So then, equipped with that ZEF scale, we started investigating the individual difference around Zoom fatigue and investigating the underlying mechanisms that were identified by Billinson. We collected data from more than 10,000 participants. Okay, so now let's look first at the Zoom usage and its impact on Zoom fatigue. So we asked participants how many meetings they had per day on average, so the frequency, how long were these meetings on average, their duration, and how much time the user typically had between their meeting. It's what we call burstiness. And with that, we showed that Zoom usage correlates with Zoom fatigue. So people who have more video conference calls, longer ones, and short breaks in between reported experiencing more Zoom fatigue. The second individual difference was the gender effect, and it has different aspects. So first of all, we saw that the Zoom usage differed between gender, with women reporting significantly longer meeting and less time in between than men. Why? For the moment, we don't know, and we need to investigate further. We also found that women experience more Zoom fatigue than men, and here you can see the distribution of the ZEF score by gender. So on the horizontal axis, you can see that the ZEF score is going from 1 to 5, and on the vertical axis, you can see the density of the corresponding answers. The red curve is for women and the blue is for men. And you can see that the red curve is shifted to the right. So to give you an idea of what this means, 14% of women reported feeling very to extremely fatigued, so 1 in 7, while only 5.5% of the men reported feeling very to extremely fatigued, so about 1 in 20. I mentioned earlier that women reported having longer meetings. Well, even when we control for the difference in time spent on Zoom, women still have a higher level of Zoom fatigue. So then after that, we wanted to understand this relation between gender and Zoom fatigue. So we identified mainly 2 mechanisms that seems to drive this gender difference. So the first is the mirror anxiety that I already mentioned. As I explained, from previous research, we know that people are more likely to compare themselves to a standard when you see an image of yourself, which is something stressful that can lead to negative affect. And we know that women experience this more than men. And women reported, so women taking the survey reported feeling more concerned about seeing their own image than men. So interestingly, there is this brand new study from Kristen Shockley, and in that study, participants were using Zoom as part of their regular job with or without camera for several days. And at the end of the day, they answered a question, and the researchers showed that the participant using Zoom with the camera experienced more fatigue than without the camera. They also reported that when the camera is on, these people felt like they were less engaged in these meetings. And echoing our results, women in this study suffer from the use of camera more than men. So it's very interesting when you have a new finding and another study using a different technique can see the same effect. So the second mechanism that seems to drive this gender effect is the fact to feel physically trapped during video conference. So as I already mentioned, motion and movement are very important for learning, for collaboration, and so on. And this feeling of immobility was felt more by women than by men during video conference. Okay, so two more differences that we observed. There is the age effect. So here you can see a linear regression of the age and the ZEF score. As you can see, the younger participants experience more Zoom fatigue than the older one, and this across both gender. And we currently have no explanation for this. The fourth individual difference is the race effect. So we saw that participants who identified as another race than white experienced significantly more Zoom fatigue, beside native Pacific Islander, but there we have very few data points. So it's important to note that this race effect is 10 times smaller than the gender effect. So this effect on race, on Zoom fatigue, seems to be small, but it's still significant, it's still there. So it's critically important to study this potential race effect in much more depth than what we've reached so far. Okay, so now let's talk about some ways to decrease Zoom fatigue. So first, in relation to the mirror anxiety and the fact that in video conference we are facing our own image for a very long time. On Zoom, you can hide the self view, so you do not see your own image anymore. So you can click on the upper right corner of your own video in Zoom and you have the option to disable self view or hide self view. And so participants will still see you and you will see them, but you won't see yourself. And this became like the first thing I do when I enter a Zoom room, is like I hide the self view. So the second, in relation to these large faces like staring at you, if you don't always need to see the participants so big, so you can decrease the size of your video conference window. You can also think twice before using the camera altogether. Some Zoom meeting can be conducted without the camera. You can also try to increase the distance between you and the camera to give you a bit more room to move. So you can use an external keyboard to push your computer and your camera further away. Also, any settings that would allow you to stand would help to keep you more mobile during this meeting. And for example, I purchased a standing desk during the pandemic, and this being like a game changer for me. I feel much more active, both physically and mentally, during my calls. Finally, we saw that the more intensely people use Zoom, the more they experience fatigue. So let's try to be mindful, if possible, about that. So let's try to allocate time for breaks in between and maybe try to have like shorter meetings or less of them. So of course we are aware that the responsibility of addressing Zoom fatigue should not be placed on the individual, since this could just intensify inequity. Also, not everyone can buy a standing desk, and it's not always up to the individual to decide their video conference schedule. We know from other research that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on minorities and women, resulting in widening pre-existing inequalities and gender gaps. So, for example, during the pandemic, women have reported a significantly higher rate of housing insecurity, financial insecurity. Women have carried like a heavier load than men in terms of childcare, and women also have reported increasing struggle with body image, for example. So our findings contribute to the understanding of the gender gap during COVID by showing that we just not all equal in the eyes of Zoom fatigue. So our findings should inspire companies and organizations to rethink their video conference policies and culture. So this could be, for example, prohibiting the use of video in some of the online meetings and making sure that the number of meetings, their duration is reduced for everyone, and avoiding, for example, back-to-back meetings. So I'd like now to reflect a bit about our work and where to go from here. So first of all, it's important to remember that Zoom fatigue is a new field of research that was non-existent 1.5 years ago. So there were many different research methods that we could have chosen, and we decided to go with self-reported survey. But there is like space for a lot of different kind of studies. Also, we used what we call a convenience sample. So people who already had an interest or were curious about Zoom fatigue were more likely to take up the survey. So the population in our study is not representative of any population, the American population or any population. So for example, we had many more women taking up the survey than men. Although, to make sure that our results were valid, we did run a smaller study with this time only 700 participants with a random sample, and we found the same results in terms of gender and age and so on. So also, since people attention span were taking a survey is very short, we need to make decision concerning the question that we're gonna keep. So it means that a lot of questions that we would have wanted to ask had to be removed. So for example, we have no information about the job position of these 10,000 participants, and that would have been valuable information as well. Okay, so the classic research process takes several months to a year before your publication, your paper is available for everyone. And it does not really work when the topic you are studying is current and need to be addressed quickly. So to stimulate research interest in the field of Zoom fatigue, we decided to publish our paper on this website called SSRN, and it's a repository of preprint aiming at disseminating research quickly. So basically with SSRN, you make your publication, your paper available right away while you wait for the publication to be accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. So we posted very quickly 2 papers over there. The first one is the development of the scale that we wanted to be available to anyone as soon as possible. And the second one is the results that I just presented. And to give you an idea of how timely this research is, the first paper has been downloaded more than 9,000 times and the second more than 5,000 times. So when it was on SSRN, we kept, of course, going through the process of peer-reviewed, and the first paper is now published in a peer-reviewed journal, and we are finishing the revision of the second paper. So since their publication on SSRN, many researchers have contacted us to use, to adapt, or to translate the scale. And we really hope that all that's gonna help have a lot more knowledge about Zoom fatigue. So we are currently testing a ZEF scale for kids to investigate Zoom fatigue in school this time. We are also discussing with researchers in the field of race and health to work together on the race effect that we highlighted. It's also very important to run studies using different methods, such as interviewing users, observing these users, but also like control experiment when you would have a participant joining video conference under very specific circumstances and then see how this influenced their fatigue. We are also very curious about comparing the fatigue due to Zoom with the fatigue inherent to other kind of meeting, like face-to-face meeting or phone call, for example. So as you can see, the result that I showed uncover a very, very small portion of what we need to understand about Zoom fatigue. I would like to conclude by reminding all of you that our goal is not to deter anyone from using Zoom or any other video conference platform. These tools have helped us so much to keep our life as normal as possible during the pandemic. And we just try to understand a new phenomenon that is Zoom fatigue in order for each of us, individual but also as organization, to be aware of these weaknesses or these problems, these challenges with video conference and adapt to it. There is, of course, for the moment, a lot of discussion about the fact that the 9 to 5 Monday through Friday commuting model might not be appealing to people anymore now that we found ways around it. We now know that we can do most of our work without commuting, for an hour or 2 hours a day, because commuting has a very high cost, like private cost. No one wants to spend so much time in transport, but also the environmental cost of the greenhouse gases emitted due to transportation. So the workplace might become increasingly hybrid, with meetings where a part of your team will be on site, but the rest will be remote. And this new setting will, of course, raise new issues, new challenges, and Zoom fatigue might be a part of it. So that's why we need to keep studying this topic, that Zoom is not going away anytime soon. So with that, you are more than welcome to reach me either by email or on Twitter. And thank you so much for the invitation, and I would be very happy to answer to your questions.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Yeah, I'd be interested, especially in the comparison to in-person meetings. Sometimes I wonder if it's just that people don't like meetings in general. But obviously, the kind of people that were using Zoom would be more of what we would in America refer to as white-collar workers in general. So I do wonder about that comparison in terms of fatigue. So we have a good question from Virginia. Do you know if there is any effect of using Zoom meeting now that we are not in lockdown and most of us are back in the office every day? Although we see our peers in the office oftentimes are still interacting remotely via Zoom.
That's a very interesting question, and a very brand new one, because it's just like these few weeks that we're back in the office, or some of us are, depending on where we're located. But the answer is no. We really have no idea, and this is like something that would be very interesting in investigating through, following up people going from lockdown or a situation where you work from home 5 days a week, and following them going back to the office and following how their Zoom fatigue is changing.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. And then Sarah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask, are there any effects of using multiple platforms on a regular basis with using Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Skype and FaceTime and bouncing back and forth amongst these platforms, both in professional and personal?
So I feel like I'm gonna answer to a lot of questions by we don't know, because we don't know. One thing that we are for the moment looking at, or we have the data, we are analyzing the data, is about how fatigue relates to the use of certain features of these platforms. So do people who hide the self view experience more or less fatigue than the other one? So in a few months, we would have some answer to that. But comparing the platform, we don't know.
Okay. And right now, I'll give people a few more moments to type their questions in here. But I did want to, promote, I guess, the Women's Caucus event on Monday, featuring Sarah and also Melissa and Kay and Laura, who are panelists on this one, on salary negotiations. I don't know if Laura, if you wanted to say a few words about that event.
Actually, I'm going to bounce it to Sarah and Melissa, because they were the ones who arranged it with Kay Gruder. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Melissa, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, that was a topic that I think came from our membership that was asked to try to be covered. And so we were able to reach out and find an expert in the field about salary negotiation, as well as all of the other items that come along when you're taking a new job. And so hopefully on Monday, if you can join us, there's information on the Caucus website where you can register for that. And the time, I'm drawing a blank on the time, Mike, is that at almost a long time? 11 a.m. I think Eastern.
Yeah, it's 11 a.m. Eastern.
11 a.m. Yeah. Okay. And you can join us for that. We'd love to have you there. And of course, go to our website and learn more about the Caucus and the membership there. And there are other Caucus events as well that you can find out more information about.
I have a question, Geraldine. Your research, when you talked about more likely to have discord or mating reactions when you're close to people and you're making eye contact with them, were there any studies that looked at if you're more likely to just naturally be confrontational when you're on Zoom right when you begin a meeting, and how that potentially could make you more exhausted because you have to kind of be on edge for that?
No, I haven't read anything about that. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. But I cannot think about any studies. Like it seems that, seeing anything like any image bigger would like be more triggering for people, but does it translate into like more confrontation? I don't know.
Okay. And I still don't see anything else. So I just once again want to thank you again, Geraldine, for presenting on this research. It's things that I feel like people are generally aware of, but it's really nice to have some kind of quantifiable study or research behind these things that we just have a feeling about. So we appreciate the work you've done in this regard, and we really appreciate you sharing it with us, because I know all of our registrars, they have to work with so many different departments and our admissions professionals. It's so hard to limit the amount of remote meetings they have, or meetings in general. So this is something that our members are definitely feeling, and any ways to, I guess, quantify and mitigate those issues they might be feeling is really helpful. And I did just see another question come in as I was doing my conclusion wrap up, but it's not a good one. From Bryn, she asked, have there been many studies noted on the physical impact of Zoom over time, like eye strain and so on? I realize this is a bit removed from the psychological impact, but I think you did have a slide that touched on a little bit of that kind of blurriness that might pop up after extended use.
So that's a very interesting point. So when we started creating the scale, the questionnaire, so basically to end up with these 15 questions, we started with 50 questions. And a lot of questions were about, does my shoulder hurt? Does my arm, eyes and all, physical impact. And basically, you go through these different versions of the survey, and statistically, you see that some questions are not like providing any important information, and so you remove them. And most of the visual question actually got removed. So it seems that the visual aspect was not something that was important in the creation of that survey. But another like studies focusing on that aspect specifically would be very interesting, which would be like, as mentioned, like it would be less of a psychological study, but more, for a different field of research, but extremely interesting.
That's great. Thanks for that answer. And I know we have a lot of PhDs that had to do lots of statistical analyses, so I'm sure it's over my head, but I'm sure there's lots of other people in here that understand what was going on there. So I don't see any other questions, and I did my little wrap up. I don't know if you have any parting words for us, Geraldine.
Well, simply that as a researcher and as a woman, I think it's very important to identify this kind of feelings that we might have, and understanding that like nothing is wrong with us as person. It's actually a phenomenon that a lot of people are experiencing, and knowing that it exists, understanding how it works, and having a discussion about it is, I think, a very important step into addressing it and acknowledging that it's going on and we're experiencing it.
Very good. And of course, as I said that, for your concluding one, so we got another question, another kind of survey specific one. Did the survey control for gender bias?
So no, it did not. So we had only questions. So we had female and male that were like dominant, and very few people who identified as non-binary, for example. And so we didn't have enough to do any statistic on that. So we were not able.
I just want to say I'm very interested to see where this line of research goes, and I'm definitely going to be following it. And I bet a lot of other people on the call today are as well. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This evening for you.
Yeah, evening. Yeah, Geraldine's joining us from Sweden, so appreciate that. All right.
I absolutely concur with Sarah just on that as well. I think the research is fabulous because again, we're going to see this as part of our life, I think, for a long time to come. So really look forward to hearing and seeing what more we get.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present our work.
All right. Have a good day, everybody. Enjoy your weekend, and hopefully we'll see some of you on Monday.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Bye.